Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a story that sounds, well, pretty much impossible. How a single private company, the British East India Company, ended up controlling the entire Indian subcontinent. We're talking about a place with powerful empires and millions of people, so let's get right into it. And that really is the question, isn't it? This wasn't a king or a queen sending an army. This was a business, a corporation that was supposed to be trading spices and textiles. It was basically a corporate takeover of a subcontinent. So how on earth did they pull it off? Well, the answer lies in a playbook they developed over nearly 200 years. It was this slow, methodical strategy of playing rivals against each other, making deals that were really traps, and then building a whole system of control from the ground up. We're going to break down that playbook step by step. Okay, first things first. How did the British even get their foot in the door? You've got to remember, they weren't the first Europeans in India, not by a long shot. And they definitely weren't the most powerful, at least not in the beginning. You see, when the British showed up, India was already a super crowded market. The Portuguese had been there for a while, and you had the Dutch and the French too. On top of that, they had to deal with incredibly powerful Indian rulers. From their main base in Mumbai, the British figured out pretty quickly that just being traders wasn't going to cut it. They needed a political edge. So where did they find that edge? Here's the twist. Their big break didn't come from an invasion. It came from an invitation. The mighty Maratha Empire, their biggest rival in the region, was having its own internal power struggle. And one of the contenders, a man named Rajunath Rao, made a fateful decision. He asked the British for military help. That was the opening they were waiting for. Now, this wasn't a quick victory. We're talking about a series of wars that dragged on for nearly 50 years. In the first round, the Marathas actually united and beat the British. But the company was patient. They waited. Almost 20 years later, the divisions were back, and a new leader, Bajirao II, felt so threatened by his own rivals that he signed a treaty with the British. That was the fatal mistake. It led to 2 more wars, and by 1818, the Maratha power was completely gone. So now they have a political foothold. But how do you expand that across a massive country? They didn't have the numbers to conquer everyone. So what did they do? They rolled out this brilliant and, frankly, ruthless contract, a trap that caught rulers one by one. This was the masterstroke, a plan called the Subsidiary Alliance. It was the brainchild of Governor-General Lord Wellesley, and the sales pitch was genius. It was basically, look, we've got a modern army. You've got enemies. Sign this treaty and we'll protect you from everyone. To a ruler who felt insecure, it sounded like a fantastic deal. But, of course, the devil was in the details. The terms of this protection were the trap. First, you had to let a British army camp out in your backyard. Second, and you had to pay for that army, either with cash or by handing over a big chunk of your territory. Third, you couldn't make friends or go to war with anyone else without British approval. And finally, a British official was going to live in your court, just to advise you. Rulers basically traded their freedom for a little security. Okay, so political control is spreading. Now the company has a new problem. How do you actually run a subcontinent? Their answer was to build a brand new operating system for India, designed from the ground up for one thing: control. They didn't just tweak the old systems, they scrapped them and built their own. They created this 4-part machine: a professional civil service to handle the paperwork and collect taxes, a modern military to defend their territory and grab new land, a police force to keep order on the streets, and a unified court system. These 4 pillars became the steel frame that held the whole thing together. Now, that new court system introduced a pretty radical idea for India at the time: equality before the law. The idea was that the law was the same for everyone, no matter your social status. But, and this is a huge but, there was one giant exception: Europeans. They had their own courts and their own laws, making sure they were always a class above the people they ruled. And this new system could be absolutely brutal. Just look at the story of Chhatrapati Pratap Singh of Satara. Here's a guy who was trying to do everything right. He built roads, water tanks, even schools for girls. He embraced modern ideas. But did it matter? Nope. In the end, the British decided they wanted his state, so they just dethroned him and sent him into exile. His story shows you even playing by their rules couldn't save you. Now, control is one thing. But let's not forget the East India Company was a business. The end game was profit. So the next phase was all about the money. It was time to completely rewire India's economy so it would feed the factories back in Britain. A huge part of this was changing the land tax system. Before, taxes were usually based on how much you actually grew, and you could pay with grain. There was some flexibility, but the new system? It was rigid. A fixed tax based on the land area. It had to be paid in cash, on time. And if you couldn't pay, they took your land. It wasn't about funding a state anymore. It was about maximizing profit for the company. And for the average farmer, this was a catastrophe. To get that cash, they had to sell their harvest right away when prices were at rock bottom. If that wasn't enough, they had to go to money lenders and mortgage their land. It was a debt trap that for so many ended with them losing the land their families had worked for generations. On top of all that, the British started pushing farmers to grow cash crops. Cotton, indigo, tea, things that were needed for the factories back in England. So you stop growing food for your own community and start growing crops for a global market. This whole process, the commercialization of agriculture, meant India's farms were now working for Britain's economy, not for India's people. So, the British had remade India's politics and its economy to suit themselves. But in doing all this, they set off enormous social and cultural changes, some of which they never saw coming, and which would, ironically, lead to the end of their own rule. A huge piece of this was technology. Think about the year 1853. That's when the very first railway in India started chugging along, and soon after came the telegraph and a modern postal service. For the first time, the country was literally being wired together. Now, let's be clear, the British built these things for themselves, to move troops faster, to send orders, to control their territory. But here's the thing they didn't count on. Those same railways that moved soldiers also moved people and ideas. Those same telegraphs also connected Indians from different regions who had never interacted before. A shared Indian identity started to form. The British also introduced some social reforms, and most critically, English education. Their goal was practical. They needed a class of English-speaking Indians to help them run the empire. But this education exposed a new middle class to Western ideas like liberty, democracy, and nationalism. And soon they started asking, hey, what about these ideas for our country? This was the group that would go on to lead the movements for social reform and, eventually, for independence. Which leaves us with this final, really complex question. Was it modernization or was it exploitation? The British brought technology, new laws, and ideas that shaped modern India. But they did it through manipulation, force, and for their own profit. They built an empire, but in the process, they accidentally planted the seeds of their own destruction and the birth of a new nation. It's a legacy of both transformation and trauma, leaving us to ask, who truly benefited in the end?